It was August 10th, 2011, a few seconds past 11:34 at night, and a young man named Odee Perry was on his bicycle heading north on the 6400 block of South Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Drive when a silver car pulled up and two figures stepped out near the bus stop on 64th Street. Odee made it exactly one block before the shots rang out, and the block he had given everything to protect would never have the same name again. The Parkway Garden homes sit on the 6400 block of South Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Drive on the south side of Chicago. It's a housing complex that for most of its existence was just another stretch of the city the rest of the world had no reason to think about. But inside those walls, a completely different set of rules applied. In 2006, the Black Disciples Gang, or BD for short, moved from the Randolph Towers, which used to be their headquarters, and had taken over the Parkway Garden complex and renamed it Wick City, which is short for Wild, Insane, Crazy City. And the person who made rivals think twice before stepping near that block was a young man named Odee. Odee Perry Jr. was born on May 13, 1991, and he grew up right there in the gardens. By the time he was in his late teens, he had become one of the most respected and feared figures in the entire Wick City Black Disciples. He had no murder charges and no major convictions, just a record of small things like trespassing, possession, and disorderly conduct. But on the street, his reputation was something else entirely.
Everybody looked up to him. He was one of them ones from back then. Everybody was scared of Odee.
Odee controlled who came onto the block and who didn't, and everybody knew it. Younger BD members looked up to him like he was family. Two of those younger members were a kid named Keith and another named Davon. The world would eventually know them as Chief Keith and King Von. But as powerful as Odee was in Wick City, he existed inside a conflict that had been building for years, and it was about to find him. For context, in 1969, David Barksdale of the Disciples and Larry Hoover of the Supreme Gangsters joined forces and formed the Black Gangster Disciple Nation, or BDGN for short, one of the most powerful street organizations Chicago had ever seen. Almost immediately, the alliance seized control of the Southside drug trade, pulling in over $1,000 a day in profits, with cocaine and heroin as their primary products. Their revenues would eventually scale into the hundreds of millions annually. The same communities the BGDN were building and helping to thrive would soon be flooded with the drugs they were selling, with some members getting extremely rich and others falling victim to the same product they were supposed to move. But that alliance had a fault line running through it, long before it broke. Jerome Shorty Freeman, one of David's most senior lieutenants, had a personal score to settle with Larry that had nothing to do with gang politics. Larry had taken up with Jerome's girlfriend, and Jerome never let it go. For years, David's authority was the only thing keeping that tension from becoming something worse. When David died in 1974 from complications of an old gunshot wound he'd never fully recovered from, that authority died with him. Jerome refused to submit to Larry, who moved to take control of the entire organization. Instead, he pulled roughly a third of the membership with him and went to war, escalating to a 2-year internal conflict that tore the BGDN apart. By 1976, the split was permanent. Jerome's faction became the Black Disciples and Larry kept the Gangster Disciples, or GD for short. And two groups that had once shared the same founders, streets, and colors spent the next several decades trying to kill each other. By the late 2000s, the BD faction in Wick City and the GD faction operating out of the St. Lawrence and Eberhart area, also known as STLEBT, were at each other's throats over the Woodlawn drug trade. By late 2010 into 2011, it had gotten considerably worse with social media taunts flying back and forth and shootings piling up. The 6400 block of South King Drive alone recorded around 19 separate shooting incidents in the first half of 2011. There was a death that had been sitting on Wick's side of the feud, like an unpaid debt, for nearly 2 years. On the night of May 21st, 2009, a 17-year-old Black Disciples member named Edric Walker, known on the streets as Trigger Ty, was shot multiple times in the 6500 block of South Evans Avenue in the West Woodlawn neighborhood and did not survive. The Black Disciples believed members of the STLEBT faction were responsible, and Odee, who controlled that block like a gatekeeper, decided January 12, 2011 was the day to retaliate. Shondell Gregory was 15 years old and known on the streets as Stuka. He was a member of the GD's STL-EBT faction. He had a reputation even at that age for a bold shoot-first demeanor that made him as many enemies as it did allies. His own affiliates described him as a teen hitman who had been active in the BDGD war long before most boys his age had any business being near it. Whatever specific moves he made in those streets, O'Block believed he had made them, and that made him a target. Stuka was standing at a bus stop at 63rd Street and St. Lawrence Avenue when a dark-colored vehicle pulled up. A passenger wearing a half mask stepped out and opened fire, hitting him multiple times before disappearing back into the car and pulling away. Stuka died on that corner, and what the streets said almost immediately was that this shooting was not random. The STL-EBT faction renamed their territory Tookaville in his memory, and on the other side of the feud, his name became something else entirely. A taunt, a diss, a word that rappers from the BD world dropped into songs to remind the GDs of what had happened on that corner. The phrase smoking Tuka spread through Chicago slang as both a reference to strong marijuana and a way of saying saying he wanted someone dead. One of the rappers in Black Disciples, King Von, put it plainly in a song. Trolls photoshopped rolls of toilet paper into pictures of Tuka's funeral viewing, treating his body like trash, and the mockery never really stopped. But underneath all of it, what mattered most was that his death had set something in motion that neither side of that feud was going to be able to pull back. On the streets, the word spread fast, with people suspecting the shooting was connected to Odee and his crew, and the STL-EBT faction began making plans to get their lick back in ways nobody on the block was prepared for. Among the people who felt Tuka's death the most was a 15-year-old girl who had known him well from their childhood. Her name was Gakira Barnes, who went by K.I. on the streets. Some called her Lil Snoop, a nickname borrowed from the cold-blooded female enforcer in the HBO series The Wire, and that comparison was not made lightly. She had already been carrying grief long before Tuka was killed. Her father had been shot dead on Easter Sunday in 1997 in a killing that was gang-related, before she was even a year old. She never got to know him, and losing him so early made her fiercely self-reliant on one hand, and desperate to protect the people she did have on the other. She had grown up in Woodlawn, enrolled in a math and science institute as a young girl, and dreamed of becoming a social worker. However, by the time Tuka was killed, the life she had planned gave way to a different one entirely. Losing Tuka, and then watching him get mocked online by the people who killed him, rivals editing toilet paper into a photograph of him lying dead in his casket, pushed her across a line she never came back from. She joined the GD's STL-EBT faction and became known in those circles as a hitta, the street term for a shooter. Law enforcement suspected her in 3 to 5 shootings, including at least 1 murder, though she was never charged because witnesses refused to talk. Gakira made no effort to hide her hitta position, especially on X, which was formerly known as Twitter. She openly threatened rivals, posting about the deaths of friends, and appearing in drill rap music videos with her face covered by a bandana and an automatic pistol pointed directly at the camera. A drill song from her faction referenced her by name as a young killer, and the local rap scene treated her like a figure out of a story too extreme to be real. Columbia University professor Desmond Patton, who spent years studying her social media presence, put it plainly. She almost didn't seem real. There was this devilish, monstrous little girl who was going around killing people. Chicago journalist Frank Main was more direct. She was thought to be one of the most notorious shooters in the history of that neighborhood, and she's a girl. Moving in the same STL-EBT circles as Gakira was a 17-year-old named Rodney Stewart, known on the streets as Bostrel. Where Gakira had built her reputation through relentless killing and body count, Bostrel had built his through precision that made him stand apart even in a world full of people willing to pull a trigger. By the time August came around, 7 months had passed since Tuka was buried, and the STL-EBT faction had spent every one of those months carrying that loss. On August 10, 2011, Odee got on his bicycle and rode toward the Swisher Suites at 6421 South King Drive, his friend J Hood coming along on foot beside him. They went inside together, picked up what they came for, and that was supposed to be the end of it. A silver 4-door sedan had been circling the area before Odee left the store. At 11:34 p.m., Odee walked out of the store, got back on his bicycle, and started riding northbound on Martin Luther King Drive, but he never made it far. In the next minute, at 11:35 p.m., near the bus stop on the 400 block of East 64th Street, the two shooters approached on foot, and the male shooter opened fire. J Hood, still near the store, looked northbound and watched Odee fall from the bicycle onto the ground. Odee got up and tried to get away, but the male shooter came after him and fired 10 more shots, following him down the block before fleeing eastbound on 64th Street. 2 other people were on the block that night, who had no connection to either side of the feud: a CTA janitor working nearby and a CTA elevator repairman sitting in his parked truck. Both watched the shooters flee eastbound on 64th Street and disappear into the night. A woman who had been standing at the bus stop on the 400 block of East 64th Street with her young child saw the male and female shooter waiting near a bus stop using her and her child as cover. The shooters only stepped out only as Odee rode past. Officers would respond to dispatcher's call of a person shot, and upon arrival, they found Odee in the street, bleeding from what they believed was a single gunshot wound to the right side of the neck. That initial assessment was wrong on 2 counts, and those errors would follow him into the operating room. Odee was rushed to Stroger Hospital, where Dr. Wiley and his staff worked to stabilize him based on what the officers had reported: a single wound to the right side of the neck. It was only after they began working on him that they discovered a second wound to his left shoulder, a wound the chaos of the scene had completely masked. By that point, the medical team had already lost critical minutes treating him, and their efforts ran out before the night did, and Odee was pronounced dead at 12:18 a.m. on August 11, 2011. However, by the time the autopsy was done, the coroner recorded 2 gunshot wounds, one entering the front mid-left side of the neck and exiting near the upper left arm, and another entering and exiting the mid-left buttock. What the streets noted immediately was that he had been shot on August 10th, the night of Tuka's birthday. It was not a coincidence. It was a message, and within hours, the streets already knew who did it. Detectives interviewed all three witnesses as part of the initial investigation. The CTA workers could not pick anyone out of a photo lineup. The woman at the bus stop could describe exactly what she had seen, but the code of silence on Chicago's South Side is not something people break lightly, and she was not ready to go on record. The residents knew that if they snitched about any gang-related shooting, they risked retaliation not just against themselves, but against their family. Word on the street was that Gakira had been the main shooter, and that Bostrel had been there too. People were stunned not because anyone doubted it, but because of what it meant. A teenage girl had done the thing that most grown men in that world never actually do, and even went ahead to post a picture of herself posing with a firearm that her affiliates identified as Odee's own gun. Back in Parkway Gardens, the grief turned into something permanent, causing the Wick City Black Disciples to rename the 6400 block of South King Drive in Odee's honor, and from that point forward, it was O Block. Chief Keef and King Von, the two teenagers Odee had mentored, carried that name with them everywhere. Chief Keef brought it to national attention in 2012 when drill rap exploded across the country. In his song 12 Bars, he referenced Odee saying, "I'm hit low key, like my RPOD, bang, that was roasted." This song garnered about 500,000 streams across all streaming platforms. In another song, "Cause I'm Getting Money," Chief Keef said, this track also garnered almost 2 million streams across all streaming platforms. King Von would tattoo O Block and Odee onto his body and spend years writing music that referenced the man who shaped him and the people who took him away. In his track High Speed, King Von referenced Odee saying, "I tow 230 clips like Odee," and that track got close to 8 million streams. Meanwhile, a rival rapper named Carlton, known as FBG Duck and a part of the Gangster Disciples Flyboy gang faction, started taunting Odee's death in his music and treating it like a victory. In the track Dead, FBG dissed Odee saying, "Said I won't go diss the dead, and okay, I did it. But T-Roy and OD them." This accelerated the feud between both gangs. In early 2012, Bostrel, who was 16-year-old at the time, spotted a 19-year-old rival O-Block member named Shiroid Liggins from across the street on the 6400 block of South King Drive. Bostrel raised his laser-sighted weapon and dropped him with a single shot to the head from a distance that most people would have considered impossible, considering the street design of Martin Luther King Drive. The full crossing distance from one sidewalk to the other is roughly 80 to 120 feet. Bostrel spent the better part of 2012 trying to escape the weight of Shiroid Liggins' death on his back. He had told his grandmother, Sheila Green, that he had enemies and that he was in trouble, but she had not taken him seriously because to her, he was still the lanky, silly boy who liked to clean the house and go to bed early. Bostrel moved 4 times within 10 months, first to his mother's house for more freedom, then to his girlfriend, LaDorothy Morrison's family, then west with them when they relocated from Woodlawn to the west side in August of 2012. By late October, his school had called his grandmother Sheila to report he had missed 42 days that semester, which is nearly half of the entire semester. Bostrel told Sheila he couldn't go back, but would take classes online instead. He also mentioned to her that he wanted to leave Chicago because there was nothing there for him. He had bought a bus ticket to Iowa for November 10th, 2012, where 2 friends were waiting and a job lead was already in place. On the morning of November 8th, 2 days before that bus was scheduled to leave, Bostrel was found face down in an alley in the 2600 block of West 83rd Street, shot once in the back of the head. He was pronounced dead later that day. His grandmother knew who had done it, and so did the detectives, but no witness would step forward to say so in court, and the case went unsolved. By the spring of 2014, Gakira had spent 3 years making herself impossible to ignore. She was still posting pictures of herself holding Odee Perry's own gun after his death, and had followed it with the years of open taunting on Twitter, mocking deaths that had happened in O Block. Gakira threatened O Block members directly and called herself Tiquan Assassin after her 13-year-old friend Tiquan Tyler was shot and killed in 2012. She had gone after King Von's affiliates directly and had publicly insinuated she was responsible for the death of his close associate Jerome Wood, known as J Money, in September of 2013. On February 11th, 2014, she went after King Von himself on Twitter, taunting him for the affiliates he lost while he was remanded in a juvenile facility for armed robbery for nearly 3 years. He had written back naming the people he had taken from her side since he got out. However, all of these back and forth taunts would come to a halt on the morning of April 11th, 2014, when Gakira got on Twitter and posted her location. Whether it was a dare, a deliberate provocation, or simply the recklessness of someone who had survived long enough to believe she always would, she had handed her enemies exactly what they needed. She was at 6451 South Eberhard Avenue with her close affiliate Buta and another friend when a man in a gray hoodie and blue jeans walked toward them, drew a handgun, and opened fire. All 3 were hit. Gakira was shot 9 times with the bullets hitting her mouth, her neck, and her chest. Eyewitnesses said she ran from the scene and collapsed on the porch of a nearby home, still fighting. She was taken to Northwestern Memorial Hospital, where she died at 5:43 p.m. She was 17 years old when she died. Buddha was shot in the leg with the bullet shattering his kneecap. However, he managed to get into a car and drive himself several blocks before paramedics located him on the 4700 block of South Wabash Avenue. They rushed him to Mercy Hospital and Medical Center, where he was listed in stable condition. The third person was hit in the foot and transported to Jackson Park Hospital, where he would make a full recovery. On the street and in music circles, the belief was that King Von had avenged Odee's death. No charges were ever filed in connection with her death, but the narrative had already written itself. The girl who allegedly killed the man who made O-Block had been killed by the boy Odee helped raise. Meanwhile, while all these events were happening, Odee's murder remained unsolved on paper, even though nearly everyone who mattered in that world knew the story. But then, on August 4th, 2016, 5 years after Odee's death, a confidential informant came forward. He was a member of the Jarrow City faction, a closely allied arm of the same gangster disciples network that Gakira and Rodney had operated within. He came to detectives and told them that he had known both Gakira and Bostrel personally, and in the years before either of them was killed, each had separately admitted to shooting Odee Perry in private conversations with the informant. Detectives moved fast with this information and went back to the woman who had been standing on the 400 block of East 64th Street with her young child on the night of the shooting. She was the only person who had seen both shooters clearly with her own eyes, and in October 2016, she sat down with investigators and looked at a photo lineup. She identified both of them as Gakira and Bostrel. The CTA janitor and the elevator repairman were re-interviewed as well. Both confirmed what they had seen that night, the flight, the car, the direction east. Neither could make a photo identification, but the case no longer needed them to. In late 2016, the Chicago Police Department formally closed the murder of Odee Perry Jr., naming Gakira and Bostrel as the principal suspects. The case was done because both suspects had already been dead for years by the time the investigation reached its conclusion, and the street had collected its debts long before the law could. But as dark as this story is, a murder that took 5 years to solve on paper and cost far more lives than just one, the next case involves someone who didn't wait for the streets or the law to catch up with them. They made sure the entire world was watching in real time.
Keep breathing a bit, boy. Come on. Just keep breathing, cuz.
For 6 years, the debt of Gakira's death sat uncollected, and the man the streets named as the shooter turned the same gang war into platinum records and one of the most celebrated rap careers in Chicago history, and seemed for a moment untouchable. But no one stays untouchable forever. Because on November 6, 2020, in the parking lot outside Monaco Hookah Lounge, an Atlanta nightclub, the STL-EBT faction of the Gangster Disciples came to seek revenge. To understand how King Von ended up at Monaco Hookah Lounge that night, you have to go back to where the story begins. King Von, whose real name is David Daquan Bennett, was born on August 9, 1994 in Chicago, Illinois, and grew up in Parkway Gardens, which is now known as O-Block. King Von was 11 years old when his father, Walter E. Bennett, known on the streets of O-Block as Silk, was shot and killed by an unseen gunman. Walter had already been in and out of King Von's life for years due to his own incarcerations, so the relationship was inconsistent at best. In the 5 years that followed, David grew up without that anchor, coming of age on one of the most violent blocks in Chicago during the peak of the BD and STL-EBT war. The lack of paternal leadership and environment set King Von on the same violent path, and by the time he turned 16 in 2011, he was arrested for armed robbery and sent to juvenile detention. According to the Cook County records, King Von was initially detained for carjacking, holding the owner at gunpoint and taking the vehicle. However, because King Von was a minor, the charges were eventually dropped on that basis, but he had to spend in a juvenile facility. While King Von was in the facility, he earned his GED, which is a high school equivalency diploma, and after his release, he enrolled at South Suburban College in South Holland, Illinois. He attended a few classes and then dropped out because the streets of O-Block pulled him harder than any classroom ever could, and the war between the Black Disciples and the STL-EBT factions of the Gangster Disciples on the South Side only got fiercer. From there, things escalated fast, and on April 11, 2014, Gakira Barnes was shot and taken off the street for good. Although the streets named King Von as the alleged shooter, eyewitness inconsistencies kept charges from ever being filed at the time. Then just 3 months later, on July 24, 2014, King Von was formally arrested for first-degree murder and 2 counts of attempted murder. The victim was Malcolm Stuckey, 19 years old, a college student and college basketball player from South Holland, Illinois, who also worked as a janitor at a museum. Friends and relatives who knew him said he had no gang affiliation of any kind. On the afternoon of May 29, 2014, he drove his burgundy Pontiac Grand Prix to a birthday party at 5722 South LaSalle Street in Inglewood because his friend Marcus Carpenter was supposed to help him sell the vehicle. What Malcolm likely did not know, or at least did not fully reckon with, was that Marcus was connected to a rival gang and had arrived at that party armed. Earlier that afternoon, King Von had shown up to the party with a female companion, and the host, Lamenda Jones, throwing the birthday party for her son CJ, had come home from work around 5:15 p.m., ready to start cooking. When she walked up to her own front porch, she saw King Von there and recognized immediately what she was looking at. She knew King Von was a black disciple and was also aware that some of the other people already at the party were from a rival camp. Lamenda saw the way King Von was looking at them, that specific kind of locked-in measuring stare that in O'Block meant only one thing, and she walked straight up to him and said, "Don't start no mess in my house." King Von looked at her and said, "I'm not on that." And then he left. A few minutes after King Von walked away from the party, he reached out to a mutual associate to get Michael Wade, also known as Big Mike, on the phone because he needed him back at the party as backup. King Von himself then got on the phone and explained to Big Mike that there were guys at the party who had been giving him hard looks and whispering among themselves, and he wanted backup when he returned. Big Mike agreed and was picked up by a woman named Jasmine Mitchell, who drove a two-door silver Oldsmobile Alero with King Von seated in the back. On the way, King Von asked Big Mike if he was decent, the street slang for whether he was armed. Big Mike confirmed that he had a Glock 40 caliber with 15 or 16 rounds. King Von showed him his own gun, and they talked through what happened at the party as Jasmine drove them through Englewood. Big Mike then called someone still at the party to get a read on where their targets were. Those targets were Marquis Carpenter and Timothy Robinson, both from a rival faction, the same people whose hard stares had sent King Von walking off that porch in the first place. Marquis had already clocked King Von reaching into the car for what he believed was a gun before he left, so the tension was mutual and both sides knew exactly where it was heading. The person on the line told Big Mike not to come, that their targets were armed with a handgun. King Von said that was fine because they had two. They parked on the block west of the party near the expressway. King Von reached out to another associate who also warned him again not to come to the party location because there were kids playing out front. King Von told the person to take the kids inside. He and Big Mike walked through a vacant lot toward LaSalle Street and cut through a narrow gangway between two houses toward the front of the birthday party, King Von leading, neither of them concealing their faces. At the mouth of the gangway stood Timothy directly in their path. The moment he and King Von locked eyes, he knew something was up. He turned and ran toward the front of the house. King Von went after him without hesitation, clearing the gangway and opening fire as he gave chase. Malcolm had just stepped out of his Pontiac at that exact moment. He was on the sidewalk, cigar in hand, about to walk to the front door when the shooting erupted around him. A bullet tore into his skull, entering through his right ear and exiting through his neck, with additional shots fragmenting into his right upper thigh and left inner thigh. He fell face down onto the grass between the sidewalk and the street, bleeding out. By the time Big Mike reached the front of the house, Malcolm was already there on the ground, blood spreading beneath him, and the shooting was still going. Big Mike opened fire on Timothy, emptying all 15 or 16 rounds of his Glock 40, hitting him enough to make him stumble before running back through the gangway when the magazine ran dry. King Von ran two houses over into a vacant lot where Marcus had collapsed in. He was on the ground in the lot, bleeding from the mouth with a broken jaw and a shot to the leg. King Von stood at the entrance to the lot, raised his gun, and fired two more shots directly into his face. King Von and Big Mike ran back through the gangway to Jasma's waiting car. Jasma had stayed in the vehicle the entire time, dug down on the seat after hearing more than 10 shots fired in rapid succession. She drove them to 65th Street and King Drive and dropped them off. King Von threw his Glock 40 into Lake Michigan later that day. Big Mike disposed of his weapon as well. A paramedic named Christopher Powers responded to a call of a gunshot victim at 57th and LaSalle at approximately 6:15 p.m. He found Marquis bleeding severely from gunshot wounds to his face and lower extremities and transported him to Stroger Hospital, where Marquis would remain for a month and a half. Malcolm was pronounced dead at the scene. A fourth victim, a 24-year-old man, whose identity was never publicly released, took himself to St. Bernard Hospital with a gunshot wound to the foot. For nearly 2 months after the shooting on South LaSalle Street, the Chicago Police Department had a body, a crime scene, and no arrests. The evidence technicians had photographed the shell casings and the blood trails and the burgundy Pontiac Grand Prix sitting in the street with Malcolm's belongings still inside it. The medical examiner had completed his autopsy and ruled the manner of death a homicide. 3 people who had been present on that block and watched the entire thing unfold had looked at lineup photographs and declined to identify anyone. Whatever they knew, they were keeping it. What investigators did have, quietly and from early on, was Jasma, the getaway driver. By the time Detective Robert Garza sat down with her on July 17, 2014, she was the most valuable person in the entire investigation. She had driven the car, heard the plan, sat parked on that block while the shots rang out, and then drove both men away from the scene. Jasma knew this knowledge made her both a witness and a potential co-conspirator, and that the difference between those two things came down entirely to what she chose to say in that room. She chose to cooperate with the police. In exchange for her complete cooperation and her willingness to testify, Jasma was granted full immunity. She would not be charged with anything, and whatever legal exposure she might otherwise have faced as the getaway driver was erased entirely in exchange for her account. She identified Big Mike from a photograph that Detective Robert placed in front of her, and that identification, combined with her narrative account, gave investigators enough to move on King Von and Big Mike's arrests simultaneously. 3 days later, on July 20th, 2014, both King Von and Big Mike were taken into custody. King Von was brought into police headquarters and placed in a small cinderblock interview room at approximately 4:40 in the afternoon. The room had no windows, no natural light, no way to track the passage of time by anything other than the clock on the wall, and the clock was not always visible depending on where you were sitting. What followed was 33 hours of interrogation, conducted primarily by Detective John Halloran. King Von's initial stance was total denial. He denied owning a firearm or having any knowledge of the party and the shooting. While King Von was being processed, Big Mike was placed in a separate interrogation room. Facing the same charges and evidence, Big Mike agreed to cooperate with detectives and gave a full recorded statement naming Davin as the primary shooter, describing the plan, the walk through the gangway, and everything that followed. Armed with Jasma and Big Mike's testimony, Detective John went back to King Von and began laying the case out for him piece by piece. The police had Jasma's statement, Big Mike's early cooperation, the phone records, and what the eyewitnesses at the murder scene had described. He was not presenting this as a negotiation, but as a fait accompli, meaning the case was already built, and King Von's denial couldn't undo it, rather only make things worse for him. Barely 24 hours after King Von's arrest, he began to crack. He admitted he had been at the party and how he coordinated with Big Mike to target Timothy and Marquise. He maintained throughout that he did not shoot Malcolm Stuckey because he had not been the target. But under Illinois felony murder law, the question of which specific bullet struck Malcolm and whose finger had been on the trigger when it was fired was all that mattered. King Von had participated in initiating and carrying out the attack, resulting in Malcolm's death. He was charged with first-degree murder for the death of Malcolm and 2 counts of attempted murder for the shootings of Marcus and Timothy. He and Big Mike were held in the Cook County Jail. From early in his detention, King Von began to write lyrics, not with any particular ambition at first, but because the walls gave him nowhere else to put what he was carrying. He wrote on scraps of paper, in borrowed notebooks, over beats he had memorized or caught on contraband radios. King Von began freestyling in his cell, committing verses to memory when he couldn't write them down. He knew rapping was becoming more than a pastime and wanted to pursue it fully when he got out of jail. Lil Durk, his childhood friend, and by then a rising name in Chicago rap drill, visited him during that period and saw it too. Durk began mentoring him from the outside, sharing beats, bars, and advice across the distance that the Cook County walls created between them. By the time the trial began in December 2017, after spending nearly 3.5 years in Cook County Jail, the prosecution's case against King Von collapsed. Big Mike, the co-defendant who had been cooperating with the cops and whose recorded statement had placed King Von directly in the shooting, recanted his entire testimony. Without his testimony, the jury was left with Jasma on immunity. Eyewitness accounts that couldn't confirm King Von personally fired the shot that killed Malcolm, and a confession that King Von's defense successfully argued was the product of 33 hours of psychological pressure in a small cinderblock room. The jury acquitted King Von on all charges, allowing him to walk out of Cook County a free man. Big Mike was convicted of aggravated battery with a firearm for shooting Timothy, but was also acquitted of Malcolm's murder. After King Von's release, Durk urged King Von to move to Atlanta to start afresh because the Chicago streets could not accommodate what the rap career he was trying to build. Durk had also relocated his own record label and collective known as Only the Family, or OTF, to Atlanta before King Von's trial began. King Von did not leave Chicago right away. He stayed close to a block through 2018, recording and building his catalog, while Durk continued pushing him toward Atlanta from the outside. The pull of the block was still stronger than the pull of a fresh start, but as his music began to catch fire and the streets of Chicago grew too familiar and too dangerous for someone with his profile, he eventually made the move to settle in Atlanta and check in with his affiliates in O Block from time to time. He released early singles independently, including Problems in 2018, building a following on YouTube and SoundCloud through tracks that were raw, specific, and unlike almost anything else coming out of Chicago or Atlanta at that time. From a young age, King Von had something that made him stand out, even in that environment. He had a storytelling instinct that was almost cinematic, the ability to recall events with a precision and rhythm that made them feel alive in the retelling. Older members of the Black Disciples took notice. They said he reminded them of the gang's founder, David Barksdale, not in blood, but in presence, charisma, and the way he carried himself and commanded a room. They started calling him Grandson. The nickname spread and eventually became the foundation of his artistic identity, including his 2019 mixtape Grandson, Volume 1. King Von's bars were not just random words and rhymes, he was documenting his crimes in vivid and coherent detail. One of the tracks on the mixtape was Crazy Story, and King Von wrote it on a bus ride from Atlanta to Chicago, without even an instrumental. The song narrates a street robbery in scene-by-scene detail. A woman is used to lure a male target, who is dripping in money and jewelry. In the and put him in the line of sight of the robber who fires at him, hitting the man once in the arm and once in the thigh. Every beat of the plan, movement, and shot was laid out with the precision of someone who had either watched it happen or done it himself. The song racked up over 148 million views on YouTube and went triple platinum, meaning it had been streamed and downloaded 3 million times in the United States alone. The most quoted line from it, the one fans repeated back at him at shows, was, "From 64th and 65th, we are not from 63rd." That was O'Block's address. King Von would also reference his father's death in multiple songs over the years. One line in particular said everything. "Father was a gunshot victim. That's how I know them gunshots are vicious, so I'm shooting first and I'm not missing." That was the thing about King Von's music. The people in the songs had real names, the blocks had real addresses, and the violence had already happened, or was about to. By any measure, everything pointed upward for King Von, but the streets had followed him south. At around 5:30 a.m. on February 5th, 2019, a shooting and robbery took place in the parking lot of the Varsity, the iconic drive-in restaurant at 61 North Avenue Northwest in Atlanta's Midtown, just outside the shadow of Georgia Tech. The victim was Alexander Weatherspoon, a promoter with loose ties to Atlanta's music and nightlife scene. He was sitting in his red Jeep Cherokee when King Von and Dirk's group approached. The group had specifically targeted Weatherspoon because they knew he was carrying $30,000 in cash, an expensive gold chain, and was sitting in a vehicle worth taking. A struggle broke out at the car, during which Alexander, who was also armed, may have discharged his semi-automatic pistol before King Von fired 5.40 caliber rounds at him, striking him in the right thigh. The group then took the cash, the chain, and the Jeep Cherokee itself. Alexander managed to escape and call for help. The Atlanta Police Department responded quickly, securing the scene and reviewing footage that showed a black sedan and the stolen Jeep. The detectives identified King Von and Dirk through tips, witness identification, and the footage analysis. By the time the arrest warrants were issued in May 2019, King Von and Dirk had fled Atlanta. The charges were serious: attempted murder, aggravated assault, armed robbery, and possession of a firearm during the commission of a felony. This period coincided with King Von's growing fame as a single crazy story was gaining traction. With arrest warrants now issued for both of them, and the Atlanta Police Department actively looking for them, the two men handled the situation very differently. On May 30th, 2019, Dirk released a track called Turn Myself In, addressing the Warrens directly in the lyrics and his decision to surrender. The lyrics included lines like, "I'm an innocent man for sure. It is what it is for sure. Nobody gon' ride. Had a warrant so I can't hide." And reflections on street life, turning his own warrants into a marketing moment by releasing a track about them before walking into the station. Dirk turned himself into the Atlanta Police Department that evening, where he was processed and formally booked on the robbery charges. He posted a $250,000 bond, which is a financial guarantee paid to the court to secure his release while the case proceeded. He was out before the end of that same day. King Von was arrested on June 15th, 2019, during a traffic stop in Atlanta, and was held without bond initially. His probable cause hearing came on June 28th, 2019, in Fulton County Superior Court before Judge Ural Glanville. Prosecutors presented the surveillance footage, ballistic evidence, and Alexander's own testimony, identifying King Von as the shooter. The defense argued the footage was inconclusive, that the lighting was poor and the distance too great for a reliable identification, and that the witnesses had credibility problems of their own. Judge Ural weighed all of it and found sufficient probable cause to bind the case over for trial, citing the video and ballistic matches. King Von was released 2 weeks after his arrest, on July 12th, 2019. After paying off 10% of his $300,000 bond. He walked out of Fulton County Jail, but with imposed restrictions like house arrest and a ban on possessing firearms. The charges hung over him for nearly 2 years. They were finally dropped in late 2020, after Alexander stopped cooperating with prosecutors, and the defense picked apart enough inconsistencies in the video evidence that the state had other evidence to convict King Von with. The case was dismissed without prejudice, which meant the door was never fully closed, just left ajar. Meanwhile, another rap beef that had been building since King Von joined OTF began to escalate in plain view. King Von had developed a habit of mocking deceased rivals in his lyrics and on social media. He referenced Tuka, the STL affiliate killed in 2011, repeatedly in his songs, using phrases like "smoking on that Tuka pack" in ways that were designed to provoke. King Von also set his sights on another rapper. NBA Youngboy, whose real name is Kentrell Deshaun Golden, was one of the most prominent rappers in the South, running his Never Broke Again label out of Baton Rouge, Louisiana. As King Von's profile grew through 2018 and into 2019, the two men began appearing in the same conversations without ever having exchanged a direct word. Both men rapped about street violence, incarceration, and survival, with an almost documentary specificity, and had built their audiences on the credibility of that specificity. Comparisons were inevitable as fans on both both sides debated who was doing it more honestly, and whose bars were more grounded in actual lived experience. Those debates filtered back to King Von and Youngboy through comment sections, DMs, and the constant ambient noise of social media. What turned it from fan debate into something more personal was a collaboration that never happened. King Von had been pushing for Youngboy to release an unreleased track they had both recorded called Blame It. Youngboy never did, and the silence rubbed King Von wrongly. Then in 2019, King Von hopped on Instagram Live and played one of Youngboy's tracks, widely identified as Play With Us. He paused it mid-verse and said plainly,
Youngboy talking about on this song, bro.
What?
He talking crazy on this one.
Oh, yeah?
He ain't even like that.
Oh!
On his man.
On his
All that cap. You got cap in your raps.
Fans in Youngboy's camp took it as King Von calling him a liar in his street raps. King Von's defenders later said he was trolling for hype, and that a lot of people watching took it further than he intended. Youngboy never directly responded on camera, but the clip sparked weeks of back and forth subs and fan conflict between the OTF and Never Broke Again sides. It was during this same period that Quando Rondo, a Savannah, Georgia rapper, signed to Youngboy's Never Broke Again label, was dragged into the growing beef between King Von and Youngboy. Old footage that had circulated online showed Quando and King Von on genuinely friendly terms years earlier, laughing and clowning around with no visible tension between them. But the dynamic shifted in 2019 after Von's Instagram live diss of Youngboy's music. Quando had no direct role in any of it, but because he was Youngboy's label mate, it put him in the orbit automatically. Although no shots were traded between him and King Von at this point, he no longer associated himself with King Von. In March 2020, Von dropped Why He Told from Love and James, his second mixtape, a 16-track project released through Lil Durk's Only the Family label, whose title was a nod to LeBron James. The song aimed squarely at the Youngboy camp's running narrative about credibility. The chorus hammered it directly. That boy was realer than a man. I don't know how he folded. Man don't know how. He could have hit them with the script, but he ain't sugarcoated. But he ain't nah. Fans tied it immediately to Youngboy's legal history and his plea arrangements from a 2016 shooting. King Von amplified the track on social media, posting captions like, "We smoking on that back," throwing the exact language Youngboy had used to taunt a block, throwing it back across the line. By May 2020, with the country locked down amid the wave of the COVID-19 outbreak, Youngboy dropped Dead Trolls from his mixtape 38 Baby 2. The track was direct and the title itself was a taunt, trolls being street slang for dead rivals, and the whole thing was structured as a public celebration of losses on the other side. Lines like, "That little bag and that boy won't say it," were widely read as a shot at King Von specifically, referencing Youngboy's decision to deny him a feature. Another line, "Plan on staying in something in Atlanta too," landed like a thread pointed directly at King Von, who had relocated there. Quando appeared in the music video alongside Youngboy, making his position in the conflict impossible to misread. Then in August 2020, what had been a music and social media conflict picked up a personal edge. King Von was spotted with Janya Meshel, Youngboy's on-again, off-again baby mother. King Von cleared the air immediately, insisting the link-up was music-related, but it didn't sit well with Youngboy. He responded immediately, posting a photo with his son and the caption, "I'm gonna make sure that my son your daughter since you trolling." Through the summer of 2020, the exchanges kept coming. Youngboy dropped Casey Talk in August 2020, which included bars like, "I ain't with the talkin', we gon' show 'em," interpreted broadly as shade toward King Von's habit of matching insults with more insults rather than action. The audience had watched it all build, bar by bar, post by post, and they knew, even if no one said it plainly, that it was building towards something. But while the Youngboy beef was playing out online, a separate and older war was still running in the background. Carlton Weekly, known as FBG Duck, was a rapper from the Tookaville faction of the Gangster Disciple. FBG Duck had been one of the loudest voices on the Tookaville side, mocking O-Block losses in his music and his social media, and Von had returned every shot. The feud between them had already bled into Von's music in ways that were impossible to miss. In February 2020, King Von released Took Her to the O. The lyrics described him in a car with a stripper he met at a store, seducing her, until a man named Duck steps to him and throws a brick at his car. King Von responds by shooting Duck twice and killing him. He then takes the girl back to the O, which is O-Block. The character Duck was widely understood to be a direct reference to FBG Duck, and the line, "She started laughing, she said, that he from 63rd," left very little room for interpretation. The song peaked at number 47 on the Billboard Hot 100 and went triple platinum. 6 months after that song dropped, on August 4th, 2020, FBG Duck was shot and killed in broad daylight on East Oak Street in Chicago's Gold Coast neighborhood, right outside the Dole Dolce & Gabbana store at 43 East Oak Street. Within hours of the news breaking, King Von was on social media celebrating, and word on the street was that he had placed a bounty connected to FBG Duck's death, somewhere between $50,000 and $100,000. And with it, King Von drew another clean line about who he was and his loyalties to O Block. On October 30th, 2020, King Von released Welcome to O Block, his debut studio album on OTF and Empire record label. And 37 days after that album release, on the evening of November 5th, 2020, King Von was in Atlanta, his adopted home base since 2018, celebrating a commercial peak he had spent his entire adult life building toward. Welcome to O Block had debuted at number 5 on the Billboard 200 in its first week, with 26,000 units sold. He and his O Block and OTF crew, which included his manager Jameson Francois, known as 100K Track, along with a group of associates from Chicago's Parkway Gardens, arrived at Opium nightclub on Brady Avenue Northwest in West Midtown Atlanta around 10 or 11 in the evening. Meanwhile, word was already circulating within the group that Quando Rondo was somewhere in the city that night. The group discussed Quando's location and what to do about him should they run into him. Around 2 to 2:30 in the morning on November 6th, Opium nightclub was closing down for the night. King Von's and his group decided to take the party southeast, a 10 to 15 minute drive across the city to Monaco Hookah Lounge at 255 Trinity Avenue Southwest in downtown Atlanta, a smaller hookah-focused venue known to remain open until 4 a.m. It was situated just a few blocks from Grady Memorial Hospital. It was also where Quando and his crew of about 6 to 8 people had already been. King Von's crew numbered somewhere around 20 to 30 people. Quando was asleep in a parked SUV in Monaco Hookah Lounge parking lot when King Von's convoy pulled in. About an hour later, at approximately 3:15 in the morning, King Von finally spotted Quando in the SUV. Multiple people and associates who were right there in that parking lot advised him not to walk over, but King Von went anyway. Meanwhile, the commotion woke Quando, who immediately got out of his car to investigate the noise. What happened next was captured on the surveillance camera mounted on the Monaco Hookah Lounge. At approximately 3:20 a.m., King Von approached Quando's SUV and punched him, knocking him to the ground. King Von's group of 20 to 30 people and Quando's crew of 6 to 8 surged forward to defend their affiliates, leading to a massive brawl that took over the entire parking lot within seconds. And then Timothy Leaks, known in Rondo's circle as Lil Tim, a close associate and right-hand man to Quando from Savannah, Georgia, drew a handgun and fired multiple shots into King Von's chest and torso at close range. King Von collapsed to the ground, causing both groups to draw their weapons and fire at each other. Some off-duty Atlanta Police Department officers who had been working security detail at the lounge drew their own weapons and moved in, along with an on-duty patrol officer who had been nearby to bring the brawl under control. The scene was now a full firefight. A close friend and O Block associate of King Von's named Nazir Rice, known as Slutty, and the brother of a late O Block figure named T. Roy, tried to return fire during the chaos, but his gun jammed. He was fatally shot, though accounts differ on whether the bullet came from Quando's crew or the officers who had opened fire. Another close associate, known as O Block Louie, was shot in the head during the firefight. King Von's manager, Jameson, was grazed by a bullet, and Timothy Leaks himself was struck by a gunshot wound to the leg. In the chaos of the crossfire, a 34-year-old Chicago man named Mark Blakely, who had no confirmed affiliation to either side and had simply been present at the lounge that night, was also struck by gunfire. By approximately 3:25 that morning, which was about 5 minutes after King Von threw the first punch, the shooting was over. 6 people had been shot, and 3 people among them would not survive. Jameson and the crew did not wait for an ambulance. They lifted King Von into a private car and drove him to Grady Memorial Hospital, a level 1 trauma center, and the primary facility for serious gunshot wounds in the city. King Von arrived in critical condition and was pronounced dead shortly afterwards. Mark, the innocent bystander, also died from his gunshot wounds. The Atlanta Police Department formally requested assistance from the Georgia Bureau of Investigation around 4 a.m. on November 6 to independently oversee the officer-involved portion of the case, reviewing body camera footage, ballistics, and determining whether any APD rounds had caused specific injuries or deaths among those shot. 2 men from Quando's camp, 21 years old Johnny Harris and 23 years old Kevin Jones, were arrested at the scene and charged with aggravated assault and related offenses. Rumors of King Von's death quickly spread across social media, and by the morning of November 6, Empire CEO Ghazi Shami confirmed the news publicly on Instagram. Timothy, who had been transported to Grady Memorial Hospital by Quando for treatment of his leg wound, was arrested on the morning of November 7, 2020 by the Atlanta police and charged with felony murder. That brought the total number of arrests to 3, all from Quando's side. Between Von's group of 20 to 30 people and Quando's crew of 6 to 8, the overwhelming majority of everyone present that night simply walked away. The response to his death was immediate and split completely down the lines that had defined his life. Lil Durk learned of the news during an Instagram live session, when followers began flooding his comments with the reports. As soon as he read the comments, he ended the live stream. He later broke his silence with a single post saying, "My twin gone, I love you baby bro." On the other side, Youngboy and Quando did not publicly react to the news. However, other affiliates and even Youngboy's brother, NBA, Self-Paid openly celebrated.
The joke's on you, you diss, now you getting rapped on. Yeah. Yeah.
8 days later, on November 14th, 2020, King Von was buried at Burr Oak Cemetery in Alsip, Illinois, in a private ceremony. In the months that followed, on March 27th, 2021, Timothy posted a $100,000 bond and walked out of custody on an ankle monitor. The case continued to stall through 2021 and into 2023, and as it did, the surveillance footage from Monaco became the central document in the proceedings. It showed King Von as the aggressor, and Timothy's shots coming only after the first punch landed. On August 20th, 2023, the Fulton County District Attorney dropped all charges against Timothy Leaks in a pre-indictment dismissal under Georgia's Stand Your Ground self-defense law. The surveillance footage had shown King Von throwing the first punch, and by Georgia law, the case was done. However, within the rise and deaths of Odee and King Von, there's a third person whose name runs through both of them like a thread. And this person, who I will introduce in the next case, will bring judgment on the gangster disciples.
He might have only been 5'1", but he was a top shooter who was fair throughout the city.
James Troy Johnson was born on October 30th, 1993, and grew up right there in the same Parkway Gardens complex where all of this started. He was known on the street as T-Roy and was 5 feet 1 inch tall. His height always came up when people talked about him, not to diminish him, but because it made the contrast between his size and his reputation so striking. T-Roy was fearless in a way that people who knew him described as almost unnatural, and from a young age the block responded to it. By the time he was a teenager, he was already running alongside some of the most recognized names in Parkway Gardens, including Chief Keef, Fredo Santana, Lil Reese, King Von, and Lil Durk. That kind of company reflected how early his reputation had already started to speak for itself. King Von, who called T-Roy his treacherous twin and the person he trusted most on this earth. By the 2010, T-Roy, who was 17 years old, had fully committed to the O-Block faction of the Black Disciples. He also aligned with other Black Disciples sets across Chicago's South Side, including 300 set, which Chief Keef repped, and 600, another allied faction operating in the same area. Together, these sets moved as a connected front against rival gangster disciples factions, and T-Roy was now fully embedded in that war. The street described T-Roy as an active enforcer who the inner circle could rely on when situations escalated past words. One story that circulated widely captured just how much weight his name carried. He once walked a member of a rival set named 051 Arrow through O-Block territory and guaranteed his safety with nothing but his presence. In a world where that kind of move could get both of them killed, nobody touched them. After Odee's death on August 11, 2011, that day turned Parkway Gardens into O-Block and set a war in motion that would consume the next several years of T-Roy's life. Almost 4 months later, on December 3rd, 2011, at around 3:45 in the afternoon, T-Roy carried out the first alleged retaliation against STL EBT. A 16-year-old named Dale Fisher was walking with a friend toward a corner store near 62nd Street and St. Lawrence Avenue in West Woodlawn, deep inside STL territory. Dale went by Squirrel, but was not a confirmed gang member. However, his brother, known on the block as Main Man, had direct ties to the STL faction and had been connected to Odee's murder. In the world T-Roy was now operating in, that connection was considered enough. A silver two-door car pulled up alongside Dale, and the shooter leaned out and opened fire, hitting him in the chest. Dale was rushed to Stroger Hospital, also known as Cook County Hospital, and was pronounced dead approximately 30 minutes later. Street sources named T-Roy and an ally from the 600 set, known as D-Rose, as responsible for the shooting. The case remains unsolved, with no arrests ever made. That incident is what street culture refers to as jumping off the porch, the moment when a person goes from being an inactive into active enforcement, and T-Roy was 17 years old when he made this jump. The losses inside O-Block kept coming through 2012, and when an O-Block member named Sheroid was killed by Bostrel, it added pressure on T-Roy to respond. And the first alleged response came on April 28, 2012. Around 9:30 in the evening, a 21-year-old named Marlon Monroe, who was also known as Lil Doc of Tookaville, in the 6300 block of South St. Lawrence Avenue in Woodlawn, which was deep inside STL territory. He had recently come home from prison, where he had served time for car theft, and while he was inside, he had earned his GED and had been working toward getting getting a painter's license. He had just finished a painting job at his aunt's building that evening and stopped to walk to a corner store for a drink. A car pulled up alongside him, and the shooter leaned out and opened fire, hitting him once in the chest. Marlon tried to run, but collapsed in tall weeds in an abandoned lot nearby, where his body went undiscovered for hours until his 16-year-old relative named Odee Perry found him. The streets also attributed this shooting to T-Roy and described a single close-range chest shot as what would become a recognizable pattern. And yet again, no arrests were made as the police couldn't link T-Roy to the incident. Then on August 8, 2012, in the early hours of the morning at the corner of 56th and Wabash in Washington Park, a 28-year-old man named Terrell Joshua, known on the streets as Dirty Rel, was shot multiple times. Terrell had ties to STL and Jarrow City, a gangster disciples faction that ran against O'Block, but he had long since stepped away from Chicago, resettling in Peoria sometime between 2007 and 2010. Terrell returned to the South Side that morning for reasons that would never be determined. He was taken to a nearby hospital where he was pronounced dead. Street sources named T-Roy, King Von, and D-Rose as responsible, though this attribution has been disputed and no arrests were ever made. But this time, STL and Jarrow City retaliated quickly. Immediately after Dirty Rel's funeral, a member of Jarrow City known as 50 Shots made his way to the corner of 63rd and King Drive, just steps from the heart of O'Block itself. Just before midnight, he opened fire on an O'Block affiliate known to the neighborhood as Whitey. Whitey was Chief Keef's cousin and a friend to King Von. Even with his proximity to King Von, Whitey was low-level affiliate in O'Block, which meant that he wasn't an active enforcer like T-Roy or King Von. Although Whitey was not the one who pulled the trigger on Dirty Rel, STL and Jarrow City need a low-level affiliate dead to send a message to O'Block without triggering a full war with O'Block enforcers like T-Roy or King Von. On October 13, 2012, in the 6300 block of South Rhodes Avenue, a 17-year-old STL affiliate named Odee Perry was ambushed while walking through STL territory. This is the same Odee who had found Marlon's body in the weeds 6 months earlier, making him a symbolic target, both as a relative and a witness to an O'Block win against STL. His cousin Miles Turner stepped in front of him during the shooting and took a bullet that left him wheelchair-bound for the rest of his life. Odee was pronounced dead shortly after. Witnesses identified King Von as the shooter in that incident, and T-Roy is alleged to have been present. Street sources say both of them posted about it on Twitter afterward. By this point, the streets had given T-Roy a name that would follow him the rest of his life, the Chirac Rambo. This was not a title handed down by anyone in particular, but it honored T-Roy as a highly aggressive, active, and dangerous affiliate who goes hard in gang disputes. Then came November 8, 2012, and this is the one that cemented T-Roy's reputation in the streets of Chicago, in a way nothing before it had. Remember Rodney Stewart, also known as Boss Troll, who worked with Gakira Barnes to murder Odee. You already know his reputation as Sherrod's killer and his plan to escape from Chicago. However, 2 days before he was scheduled to leave for Iowa, Boss Troll was found face down, shot once in the back of the head. A Glock handgun was still tucked beneath his body, revealing that he'd been armed but caught completely off guard. He was rushed to Advocate Christ Medical Center and died en route with his bus ticket to Iowa still in his pocket. His grandmother knew who had done it, and so did the detectives, but no witness would step forward to say so in court, and the case went unsolved. Street lore, backed by social media posts where T-Roy and King Von reportedly wrote "Die slow" and circulated photos of bloodied boots, directly linked Boss Troll's murder to both of them as direct payback for Sherrod's death. The precision of the back-of-head shot, delivered in territory far from O'Block where they held the most power, reinforced T-Roy's Rambo reputation. He had just taken down one of STL's most dangerous figures.
Go up on me, I will shoot you. No problem. I will shoot you. Yes, I will. So if you see me, it ain't no leave me the alone.
11 days later, on November 19th, a man named James Holman, known on the streets as Lil James or Baby J, was shot outside his apartment building in the 6000 block of South Michigan Avenue in Washington Park. James was 32 years old and was affiliated to a crew called MOB, which had alliances with the STL EBT faction. He was at the front door of his apartment when a group of 4 men approached and fired at close range, striking him in the chest and right forearm. He was rushed to Holy Cross Hospital and pronounced dead at 8:54 that evening. King Von posted taunts about killing GDs, which meant killing the Gangster Disciples affiliates around the same time. On the streets, word spread that T-Roy had been asking around after the shooting, wanting to know how it went. 11 days later, James' family gathered at St. Columbanus Church on East 71st Street to bury him, with over 1,200 people in attendance. As mourners began filing out around 12:20 in the afternoon, a single gunman walked up and opened fire, hitting 2 men. The first was Sherman Miller, a 21-year-old whose mother, Mary Sistrunk, was somewhere in that crowd. He was shot in the torso and pronounced dead at Stroger Hospital before the day was out. The second was Deontay Ousley, a 27-year-old who got shot in the back as he ran. He was also rushed to Stroger Hospital, where he would survive surgery that afternoon. However, he spent the next 11 months in declining health before dying in hospice care in October 2013. Police identified both men as Gangster Disciples members and attributed the shooting to a possible counterpunch from their rivals. No arrests were made. By the time 2012 ended, Chicago had recorded over 500 homicides, its deadliest year in more than a decade. The O-Block and STL war was not the only fire burning across the South Side, but it was one of the hottest concentrated loop of killing and retaliation. As that year closed, the conflict shifted from rapid retaliation to something more patient and focused, partly because King Von was locked up in a juvenile facility on robbery and illegal firearm charges, leaving T-Roy to hold things down on the outside without his closest partner. On June 9, 2013, a man known as Stunna, whose full name was Frederick Taylor, was shot at. Frederick had been running with TTB and FOA, two Gangster Disciples aligned sets with long-standing friction against O-Block, long enough that younger members of the crew looked to him as a big brother figure. By June 2013, he had been spending time out in Las Vegas, far enough from the South Side that people around him thought he was putting some distance between himself and the war. He was driving on the Dan Ryan Expressway between the 71st and 75th Street exits when a vehicle pulled alongside his car and opened fire, killing him immediately. Another woman in the same vehicle was wounded, but she survived. Street Lore made reference to T-Roy's tweet from April 2013, where he said, "If your boyfriend BDK, spend as much time as you can with him cause this summer, it's over with." The beef was also tied to another O-Block figure, known as Boss Money. In the months before the shooting, Boss Money and Frederick had been going back and forth publicly on social media, trading disses. Street sources named Boss Money and T-Roy as the ones who carried out the shooting together. By the fall of 2013, the STL/Tookaville faction of GD took their revenge on O-Block. Jerome Wood, known on the streets as J-Money or J-Money 600, was 21 years old and was an aspiring rapper affiliated with O-Block and OTF. He grew up with T-Roy in Parkway Gardens and was part of the same crew that moved as a unit. On September 2nd, 2013, Labor Day, J-Money was lured to the 6600 block of South Rhodes Avenue in West Woodlawn, deep in STL's turfs. He was shot in the head at close range around 11:55 a.m. A witness who saw the entire incident performed CPR on him, but he was pronounced dead at the scene. The street quickly figured out that Gakira, who was still alive at the time, and her accomplice Rosalind Lil B. Patterson carried out the shooting. Gakira also confirmed this news on Twitter because she wanted O-Block to know she had done it. She wrote, "If you're J-Money homie, we smoked your homie." In another tweet, she said, "J-Money ain't use his head, so we took it off." For T-Roy, this moment escalated the war because J-Money had been an enforcer in the same fight against GD. They ran in the same circles, moved through the same streets, and had blood on his hands from the same war. Over the following weeks and months, O-Block began attempting to locate her. 15 days after J-Money's murder, the violence spilled beyond the boundaries of the gang war itself. On September 17th, 2013, at around 8:45 in the morning, a 67-year-old man named Billy Sargent was sitting at a CTA bus shelter near 61st Street and King Drive in West Woodlawn, drinking his morning coffee. Billy and his childhood friends made it a ritual to gather at that corner every morning to sit, drink coffee, and talk. Billy had no gang affiliations or connections to the ongoing conflict. He was simply a neighbor sitting at a bus stop in the border territory between O-Block and Jarrow City. A gunman opened fire that morning at the bus stop and struck Billy multiple times. He was pronounced dead at Northwestern Memorial Hospital at 9:15 that morning, 30 minutes after the shots rang out. Police sources indicated the shooter appeared to be targeting a rival gang member in the immediate area. Witnesses described the shooter as short in stature, matching T-Roy's 5 feet 1 inch height. He was arrested the next day, but later released as the police had no incriminating evidence to charge him with the murder. The war spilled into 2014, with T-Roy pushing deeper into STL territory to capture Gakira. On April 11th, 2014, O-Block finally caught up with Gakira. King Von, who was freshly out of juvie, teamed up with T-Roy and killed her. After Gakira's death, T-Roy was 20 years old and was already a legend in the streets of Chicago's South Side. Even Chief Keef, the drill rapper from O-Block, who had helped put the whole scene on the map, was putting James's reputation into his music. In his song Self, he rapped, "T-Roy got a gun that's bigger than him, and he gon' blow that bitch all by himself. He don't miss. He gon' leave the right one left." In another song, No Reason, he rapped directly, "T-Roy got my strap. He gon' blast for no reason." These were not metaphors. Keef was describing a real person doing real things, and millions of people heard it. For T-Roy, that kind of recognition meant that rivals who had never set foot on O-Block now knew his name, knew what he was capable of, and had to factor him into whatever they were planning next. Between 2014 and early 2016, the alleged incidents continued, even after King Von was remanded in jail for Malcolm's murder. Street lore and YouTube documentaries, including those by Travis Traplour Ross attribute additional hits to T-Roy in this period against STL remnants and Jarrow City faction of the Gangster Disciples. Among the names most cited was Martian Jackson, known as Twink, a prominent Jarrow City figure with his own history of conflict against O-Block allies. Twink had been locked up in Cook County Jail on charges that were not made known to the public. He was released in early 2016 and was reportedly ambushed immediately outside the facility. He was shot 16 times and pronounced dead at the scene. Street sources connected T-Roy and another O-Block member named Boss Top to the killing as retaliation for Twink's alleged involvement in hits on O-Block affiliates. T-Roy was on law enforcement's radar and had racked up multiple arrests, but without witnesses willing to testify, nothing stuck. In 2015, he was incarcerated long enough to give an interview from inside, footage of which later circulated online, but even that stint did not hold him long.
Are you gang affiliated?
No, sir.
Do you know the guy they say you was accused of fighting?
No, sir.
Have you ever seen him before?
No, sir.
Are you in the same division?
No, sir.
Every time the system picked him up, the street's code of silence got him out. As T-Roy's notoriety escalated, a new set was rising in West Woodlawn that would become one of O-Block's most dangerous enemies. They called themselves Taekwon World, named after a 13-year-old boy called Taekwon Tyler, who was shot and killed in June 2012 by Jarrow City members. Taekwon World had developed alliances with the STLEBT faction, and with Jarrow City, placing them squarely on the opposite side of the same war O-Block had been fighting since 2011. They had been watching what happened to Gakira, watching the retaliations, watching T-Roy's name appear in every significant moment of that conflict for years. A young man named Taekwon Beeson, known on the streets as TB, was one of Taekwon World's enforcers. He had been tracking the situation with T-Roy and O-Block, and in January 2017, he made a very public move. He released a diss track called Taekwon Way, and it was a direct shot mocking T-Roy and O-Block members, including deceased figures like Odee Perry. It was a declaration of intent, a public statement about where things were heading, and everyone in Chicago's Southside gang ecosystem heard it exactly that way. Street sources also note that a man connected to the STL and Taekwon World network named FBG Brick had reportedly spotted T-Roy in the South Shore neighborhood around the last days of January 2017 and had relayed that information to Taekwon. Meanwhile, T-Roy was hunting Taekwon in the same area, and both of them were closing the distance without either of them knowing exactly how close the other one already was. And on February 14th, 2017, Taekwon World caught up with T-Roy first. Around 11:56 a.m., T-Roy walked into Jeffrey Big Market, a convenience store located on the 2000 block of East 71st Street in Chicago's South Shore neighborhood. He moved through the refrigerator aisle towards the back of the store with his cousin coming right behind him. But from outside the store's window, Taekwon and Melvin Carr, who was also known as Can't Get Right, another affiliate from Taekwon World, were closely watching T-Roy. Shortly after, Melvin pushed through the front door, heading straight to where T-Roy stood talking with his cousin. Taekwon followed closely behind him, dressed entirely in black, his face masked, and one hand inside his jacket. He walked toward T-Roy and pulled out his gun. He fired once directly into the chest, at close range, causing T-Roy to drop to the floor immediately. Taekwon and Melvin ran out of the store within seconds. When officers responded to the scene, a transmission went out over the police scanner. The exact words recorded from on-scene radio were, "Male black and red jacket, white jeans, was with the victim when it happened, and he knows the offender." The transmission made it clear that T-Roy's cousin knew who pulled the trigger. Whether that meant he was an active participant in setting T-Roy up, or whether it reflected something else entirely, was never officially confirmed. T-Roy was rushed to Northwestern Memorial Hospital at 251 East Huron Street, the same building where Gakira Barnes had been pronounced dead nearly 3 years before him. At 12:38 p.m., approximately 42 minutes after the shot was fired, T-Roy was pronounced dead. The Cook County Medical Examiner's Office ruled the cause of death as a single gunshot wound to the chest. The Chicago Police Department classified the shooting as a targeted ambush. Although Taekwon and Melvin were identified through surveillance by street sources, no arrests were ever made and the case remains officially unsolved.